I want you to imagine for a second that you're sitting in the driver's seat of a car.
Okay. Like a literal car, right?
Yeah, exactly. A literal car. You've got your hand firmly on the steering wheel. Your foot is on the gas pedal, and you're just staring straight ahead at the road.
Right. Sounds totally normal so far.
Yeah, but then you turn the wheel hard to the left, and you can actually feel the resistance. You hear the mechanics kind of clunk into place under the hood,
Mm-hmm.
but the car, it just keeps drifting to the right.
Oh, man. That is terrifying.
Right. So you panic,
Yeah.
you slam on the brakes, the pedal goes all the way to the floor, but the speedometer actually keeps creaking up.
That's a literal nightmare scenario.
Exactly. At some point, the panic sets in, and you really have to stop and ask yourself a terrifying question like, are these controls actually connected to the engine? Or am I just playing with this, a toy steering wheel in the passenger seat while someone else is actually doing the driving?
Yeah, it's a profoundly unsettling realization to have. I mean, even just imagining it.
It really is.
That moment of absolute disconnect between the input you provide, like the actions you genuinely believe should yield a tangible result, and the reality of the output you experience. It just shatters the fundamental illusion of control.
And that feeling, that profound stomach-dropping disconnect, that is exactly where we are starting today's deep dive.
It's a heavy place to start.
It is, but it's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have ever looked at the state of the world or gone to the ballot box, voted for sweeping change, and then felt like absolutely nothing actually shifted in the day-to-day operation of your country.
Which a lot of people feel right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If you feel that way, well, you are definitely not alone.
Not at all. That sentiment has practically become, it's really the defining characteristic of modern political life across most Western democracies.
Right.
Voters participate in what feels like this historic ground-shifting election, yet the underlying trajectory of state policy barely even registers a tremor.
Which brings us to the core of what we are unpacking today. We have this massive stack of notes based on an incredibly extensive, frankly fascinating interview.
It's a really deep conversation.
Yeah, it's from the Dutch YouTube channel De Nieuwe Wereld, which translates to The New World. And the presenter, Marlies Dekkers, sits down with a philosopher, author, and entrepreneur named Andreas Speyerbach.
And Speyerbach lays out this thesis that attempts to explain exactly why that steering wheel feels so completely disconnected.
Yeah. She calls it the silent power grab of the technocracy.
Right. And it is a dense, highly provocative architectural critique of modern governance.
Architectural is a great word for it.
Yeah, because she argues that the real levers of power have systematically migrated away from the politicians we elect, moving instead into this shadow network of unelected bureaucrats.
And she also gets into the philosophy behind it all, right?
Yeah. Exactly. She breaks down a fundamental philosophical war happening between global universalism and local culture. And then she actually outlines a highly specific infrastructural blueprint for how to build a counter-movement.
Okay, so let's unpack this. But, and this is important before we dive into the deep end, we need to make something crystal clear to you, our listener.
Oh, yes. The disclaimer.
Right. The source material we are looking at today wades headfirst into some of the most polarized, politically charged waters imaginable.
Very much so.
We are going to be discussing mass immigration, globalism, cultural clashes, the failures of elite institutions, and the inner workings of the European Union. It's heavy, highly controversial stuff.
And our mission today is explicitly not to endorse Speyerbach's worldview, nor is it to condemn it.
Right. We aren't here to pick a side or, tell you what to believe. Our goal is to impartially break down her arguments exactly as she presented them in the interview.
We want to give you a clear, unfiltered lens into this specific brand of political philosophy.
Exactly. So you can understand the architecture of her argument and the actual mechanics of how she views the world. What you do with that understanding, whether you agree or disagree, is entirely up to you.
We are essentially operating as translators for her conceptual framework. The goal here is clarity. We really want to understand not just what she's claiming, but the underlying mechanisms of why she believes it functions this way.
So we start exactly where Speyerbach starts the interview. And interestingly, she doesn't begin with some grand, sweeping academic theory about the state of Europe.
No, it's actually quite intimate.
Yeah, she starts with a deeply personal confession. She admits to the interviewer that she has recently found herself in a state of, quote, mild depression.
And it isn't because of something going on in her personal life.
Right, it's because of the political cycle in the Netherlands. Specifically, she talks about watching the rise and the subsequent integration of a new political party called the BBB.
And to give some context for those, listening outside the Netherlands, the BBB, or the Boerburger Beweging, which is the farmer citizen movement, is a populist agrarian party.
They made massive waves recently.
They did. They essentially rose out of these massive rural protests against government environmental regulations that heavily threaten the livelihoods of farmers.
Right.
So they swept the provincial elections, riding this huge wave of anti-establishment sentiment, and they promised to completely upend the bureaucratic status quo.
And Speyerbach describes this incredibly relatable emotional roller coaster, like the cycle of hope and then just crushing disappointment.
Yeah, a lot of voters know that feeling.
Right. A new party emerges, they speak the language of the common person, they promise to fix the broken system, and people get swept up in this wave of genuine optimism.
They win a massive electoral victory.
Exactly. And then the reality sets in. They enter the government coalitions, and the machine just keeps grinding on. She says she realized she had let herself get sucked into the illusion again, despite knowing better.
It is the toy steering wheel in action. And Speyerbach uses a very striking metaphor to conceptualize why these politicians, even when they win these massive mandates, why they cannot fundamentally change the trajectory.
I love this metaphor, the crumb fight.
Yes.
Yeah.
She argues that national politicians are essentially operating like street dogs fighting over crumbs. They are fighting viciously over the remaining 10% of the political space,
Right.
while being completely oblivious to the fact that the actual cake, the other 90% of power, budget, and resources, has already been divided up and eaten in boardrooms that they don't even have access to.
And she backs up that crumb metaphor with a terrifying real-world anecdote.
This part was wild.
Yeah. Right before the national elections, she claims she went and spoke to several political heavyweights, spokespeople and insiders for major national parties. And she specifically asked them about these massive European funds. She mentions EU Next Generation and Rear Arm Europe, which are funds that she estimates are worth roughly 800 billion euros.
800 billion.
Right. And their response, utter silence, just crickets.
According to her account, they literally did not know what she was talking about.
Which is insane.
It is. The people running for the highest offices in the land, campaigning on their ability to manage the national budget and steer the economy, were entirely oblivious to the fact that nearly €1 trillion were being allocated and distributed above their heads by supranational bodies.
Okay, I buy the metaphor in theory, but I have to push back on this specific claim because it frankly sounds absurd.
How so?
Well, my analogy for this would be, imagine a family standing in their living room having a vicious, screaming, tear-inducing argument over whether to paint the walls eggshell white or beige.
Okay.
And they are so consumed by this fight over the paint that they are completely unaware that the bank is literally parked in the driveway foreclosing on the house.
That's a great way to put it.
But are we really supposed to believe that budget ministers and economic advisors literally cannot see an 800 billion euro spreadsheet? Like, how is the money actually hidden from them? Is it willful ignorance, or is there a mechanical reason for this blindness?
What's fascinating here is that it touches on a much deeper structural issue regarding how modern legislation and funding actually operate. It isn't that the politicians are literally illiterate, or that the funds are kept in some secret offshore bank account with a cartoon padlock on it.
Right.
The obfuscation is purely bureaucratic. Let's take that next generation EU recovery instrument as an example.
Okay.
This isn't a single line item on a Dutch national budget that a politician can simply cross out with a red pen. It is an incredibly complex, multi-year financial framework funded by common European debt issuance.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's a mechanism that completely bypasses traditional national budgetary constraints.
So it isn't actually competing for the exact same tax dollars they're arguing over in the national parliament.
Precisely. And more importantly, the funds are tied up in massive 500-page policy directives. And these directives are focused on highly abstract concepts like digital transition, green resilience, and cohesion policy.
Buzzword bingo, basically.
Exactly. When these frameworks are passed down, they are so dense, so filled with legal and bureaucratic jargon, that a national politician who is spending 80 hours a week giving interviews, managing minor scandals, and fighting the opposition over local tax rates, they simply don't have the staff or the bandwidth to parse them.
They was too busy with the crumb fight.
Yes. So they rely on civil servants to summarize the documents. If the summary simply says, this directive allows us to claim funds for eco-friendly infrastructure, the politician just nods, signs it, and goes back to arguing about the paint colors in the living room.
Wow. So the complexity itself is the camouflage.
Exactly.
But still, why do the politicians accept this? Why don't they, demand to see the whole board? If I were elected to run a country, I'd want to know where the trillion euros went.
Well, Speyerbach references the famous linguist and philosopher Noam Chomsky to explain the psychological and systemic incentives at play here.
Oh, Chomsky's sandbox concept.
Right. Chomsky famously argued that the smartest, most efficient way to keep a population passive and obedient isn't to silence them.
Because silencing people just makes them rebel.
Exactly. Instead, the smartest way is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but to allow incredibly lively, fierce, even toxic debate within that limited spectrum.
So you give them a really small sandbox, but you encourage them to build the craziest, most elaborate sandcastles they want. And they feel completely free because they are fighting, but they are still trapped in the box.
That is exactly the dynamic. In the modern political arena, all the supranational treaties, the EU directives, the global trade agreements, the climate accords, that is the 90% of policy that is completely off limits.
It's the cake.
It's the cake. It's already decided by international consensus. So the national politicians are forced into that remaining 10% sandbox. And because that space is so incredibly restricted, they have to magnify microscopic differences to prove to the voters that they are fundamentally different from their opponents.
Right. They have to make a huge deal out of nothing.
They will fight to the death over a 2% shift in a marginal tax rate or a minor adjustment to a local zoning law because it is literally the only territory they have left to conquer.
Which perfectly explains why the debates we see on television are so unbelievably vicious, even when the actual policy differences seem, negligible to an outsider. They have to scream about the crumbs because they don't have the cake.
Precisely.
But here is the truly dark part of Speyerbach's analysis. She points out that many established political parties, and she specifically names Dutch centrist and left-leaning parties like D66, the VVD, the CDA, and the Green Labour Alliance. She claims they actually like this system.
It is a very controversial claim, but from a perspective of political self-preservation, it makes logical sense. These parties have governed the Netherlands for decades. Speyerbach argues that they enjoy this setup because it removes the terrifying burden of actual existential statecraft.
Wait. They like having less power. That goes against literally every instinct we assume politicians have.
They like having less responsibility for the hard, unpopular decisions.
Okay, yeah.
Speyerbach uses a fantastic visual to explain this. She says these globalist, technocratic policies are like perfectly laid, shiny steel rails leading straight to Brussels.
The shiny rails.
Yeah. For a national politician, particularly a centrist one, it is infinitely easier to just put your little political cart on those shiny rails and coast along. You don't have to invent a new macroeconomic policy from scratch.
You don't have to be a visionary.
Exactly. You don't have to navigate the impossible logistical hurdles of climate engineering or global supply chains. You just nod along to the prepackaged European directives, implement them locally, and then you spend all your political capital and energy on television performing the crumb fight for the voters.
So they willingly outsource the heavy lifting to international bureaucrats so they can focus entirely on the political theater of local elections. It's almost like they've accepted their roles as middle managers rather than CEOs.
That's a very apt comparison.
But if outsourcing that political responsibility leaves a massive power vacuum, who steps in to fill it? I mean, if the politicians are just actors fighting in the sandbox, who is actually building the sandbox? Who is laying those shiny steel rails to Brussels?
That fundamental question moves us into the core architecture of her thesis, and that is the silent, methodical rise of the technocracy.
Right.
According to Speyerbach, this is not a recent phenomenon. This isn't something that just happened during the last election cycle. She views this as a deliberate 40-year project.
40 years. So going back to, what, the 80s?
Roughly the 1980s, yes. A project to systematically shift decision-making away from the volatile floors of national parliaments and into insulated supranational entities. We're talking about the European Union, NATO, the World Economic Forum, and various heavily funded global NGOs.
And she gives a specific name to the people running this sprawling system. She calls them the gray men.
Yes, the gray men.
Now, that sounds like something straight out of a dystopian spy novel,
Yeah.
But she isn't talking about shadowy cabals in smoke-filled rooms rubbing their hands together.
No, not at all.
She's talking about bureaucrats, civil servants, policy drafters, legal experts, and appointed judges. Hundreds and thousands of highly educated people who work in complete silence, stacking laws, regulations, and judicial verdicts on top of each other, year after year, decade after decade.
The term gray is incredibly deliberate here. They are gray because they are entirely invisible to the electorate.
They fade into the background.
Exactly. They operate completely outside the spotlight. Think about a national politician. They have to stand on a debate stage. They have to go to town halls and kiss babies. They have to worry that a poorly phrased tweet or some minor personal scandal will ruin their poll numbers and end their career tomorrow.
They live in constant fear.
They live in a state of constant paralyzing vulnerability. The gray men do not.
So their greatest strength, the actual source of their power, is their total lack of democratic accountability.
In a purely functional, operational sense, yes. Speyerbach argues that human nature, our tendency to bicker, our enormous egos, our tribalism, our desperate need for public validation, that is the greatest obstacle to actually getting things done in a democracy.
We get in our own way.
We really do. Politicians are crippled by their own human nature because they are locked in a perpetual competition for attention. The gray men have entirely bypassed this vulnerability because they don't have competing political interests, because they don't need to win over the 6 o'clock news cycle. They can simply collaborate. They can focus entirely on the steady, long-term execution of a decades-long master plan.
Okay, I want to ask you, the listener, to pause and think about your own life for a second. Just think about your workplace, your industry, or even, your kid's school. Think about the myriad of rules and compliance codes you have to navigate every single day.
There are so many of them now.
So many. Now ask yourself, how many of those rules were actually debated and voted on by people you can name, people who live in your community and understand your specific daily challenges?
Probably very few.
Right. And how many of those rules trickled down from some distant board of directors or a regional accreditation authority or a multinational compliance department hundreds of miles away?
Usually most of them.
Speyerbach is suggesting that the exact same loss of agency you might feel in your corporate HR department has happened to the sovereign governance of entire nations.
And to understand how this happened, we have to look deeply at the underlying philosophy driving these gray men. It is crucial to note that they absolutely do not view themselves as villains or usurpers.
They think they're the good guys.
Quite the opposite of villains, yes. Speyerbach explains that this technocratic system was built on a very sincere, deeply held belief that these educated elites possess an overarching, highly scientific vision of the future and of the good.
The good. I mean, that is an incredibly loaded, subjective term to base an entire government on.
It is, but you really have to look at the historical context here. The founders of the modern European project and the technocrats who inherited it looked back at the first half of the 20th century.
World Wars.
The world wars, the massive economic collapses, the rise of fascism, and they concluded that democratic politics is incredibly dangerously volatile. The voting public is emotional.
Well, they're not wrong about that.
Right. One day they might elect a moderate. The next day, whipped up by populism or economic anxiety, they might elect a radical who crashes the economy or starts a devastating war. So the technocratic solution was to build an infrastructure that insulates essential policy from the unpredictable whims of the public.
They basically took the steering wheel away for our own good because they decided we were terrible drivers.
Exactly. By treating governance not as a messy, emotional democratic debate, but as a clean scientific rollout of optimal data-driven solutions, you theoretically remove the risk of the public making a catastrophic wrong choice.
It's treating human society like a massive engineering project. And the source material breaks down the mechanics of how they sell this to the public. Because they don't campaign on taking your power away.
Never.
Instead, they produce these massive, incredibly polished helicopter view reports. These are documents written from 30,000 feet in the air, filled with beautiful, unassailable buzzwords. They promise, cheap green energy for all, or equitable healthcare access, or sustainable, inclusive economic growth.
And this is where the absolute genius of the bureaucratic trap lies. As Speyerbach points out, how can any local politician possibly argue against that?
You can't.
You cannot stand on a debate stage in Amsterdam or Paris and say, actually, I am firmly against cheap energy and I oppose good health.
It's political suicide.
It's total suicide. So the high-level reports get rubber-stamped by the national parliaments. Enormous buckets of funding are attached to these reports to grease the wheels of local municipalities. And the underlying policies, which contain sweeping changes to industrial regulations, farming limits, and immigration quotas, they become binding law without anyone in the public really understanding the microscopic details of what their representatives just agreed to.
And here's the ultimate, almost cruel irony that Speyerbach highlights about this entire dynamic. The technocrats, the globalists in Brussels or Geneva, they don't actually have to fight the populists or the anti-globalists.
No, they don't.
They don't have to defeat them in a grand philosophical debate in the town square.
They don't need to engage at all. They just have to wait.
They just wait, because they know that the very human nature they have insulated themselves from will inevitably cause the anti-technocrats, the people who actually want to reform the system, to turn on each other.
It happens every time.
The resistance will inevitably splinter into a dozen different ideological factions, fighting over ideological purity and the 10% of crumbs in the sandbox, while the gray men, quietly, methodically, keep laying the steel tracks to Brussels.
It is a brilliantly self-sustaining, self-protecting system. The friction of democracy consumes the opposition, while the bureaucracy glides forward silently. But, and this is the vital pivot in her argument, if this technocratic system is so perfectly designed, so insulated, and so scientifically optimized, why does Speyerbach argue that it is fundamentally flawed, blind to reality, and actively causing severe societal damage?
Right. If the machine runs so smoothly and the engineers are so smart, why is the car crashing into a ditch?
Exactly.
And this brings us to what she identifies as the massive, fatal blind spot of the entire globalist project, and that is local culture.
This segment of the interview is incredibly dense philosophically, but it's really the linchpin of her entire critique. If we connect this to the bigger picture, in the technocratic globalist model, human beings are inherently reduced to economic units.
Right, they're not people anymore.
They are data points on an incredibly complex macroeconomic spreadsheet.
They are commodities, just interchangeable parts in a global machine.
That's exactly how the models have to view them to function. If an economic model is predicting labor shortages in the European Union over the next decade, a construction worker from Afghanistan, a plumber from Poland, and a carpenter from the rural Netherlands are mathematically identical.
They just fill the slot.
Yes, a unit of labor is a unit of labor. The algorithm calculating GDP growth doesn't care about the language they speak, the religion they practice, the historical grievances they might harbor, or the localized cultural norms they hold dear. It only sees a gap in the workforce being filled by an available body.
But Speyerbach argues that reality, like on the ground in actual neighborhoods, does not work like a spreadsheet. She says this top-down model completely, willfully ignores the concept of cultural continuity.
Which is a huge oversight.
It ignores the deep-seated, historically proven realities of human group psychology and tribal behavior.
And this creates an enormous tension between theory and reality. What happens when a pristine philosophical ideal clashes with the grounded, often messy reality of human interaction? The technocratic elite, according to Speyerbach, hold a rigid, dogmatic belief in the concept of universal human rights.
Right.
And crucially, they believe deeply in the progressive mantra that diversity is inherently and always an enrichment.
And she goes so far as to say that this belief isn't just a political stance for them. It is so absolute, so ingrained in the identity of the highly educated class, that it basically operates like a religious faith.
It's unquestionable dogma.
Yeah. She claims the elite, physically and psychologically, cannot process empirical evidence that contradicts this mantra without their entire moral worldview collapsing. And to prove this point, she brings up three incredibly provocative, highly charged examples of what happens when universalist spreadsheet policies ignore local cultural realities.
And we must emphasize again here that these are Speyerbach's specific chosen examples utilized to illustrate her broader psychological thesis about the elite. She points to three distinct scenarios across different Western nations. First, she alleges that in the United States, there have been instances of Somali immigrant communities forming strict insular ethnic voting blocs.
And what's the purpose of those blocks?
According to her, it's to commit large-scale voter fraud, utilizing the open democratic systems of their host country to exclusively benefit their specific ethnic group at the direct expense of the broader local population.
Okay, so that's her first example. Second, she points to the United Kingdom. specifically the horrific grooming gang scandals in places like Rotherham.
A very dark chapter.
Extremely dark. She states that networks of men from Pakistani backgrounds systematically targeted, trafficked, and abused young, working-class, non-Islamic white girls. She claims these girls were viewed almost as spoils of war by the perpetrators due to deep cultural disconnects.
And the really crucial part of her argument there
Is that these massive criminal networks were ignored for years, right? By the local police and authorities who were utterly terrified of investigating minorities and appearing racist.
Yes, that is the core of her critique there. The fear of appearing counter to the dogma allowed the abuse to continue.
Right.
And third, bringing the critique back to her home country of the Netherlands, she cites a specific housing project in Amsterdam called Stekoost.
What happened there?
Well, the municipal government, driven by this belief that proximity naturally breeds harmony, attempted a social experiment. They housed young university students and newly arrived young male asylum seekers in the exact same housing complex.
Which sounds like a recipe for disaster.
They operated under the assumption that this would foster beautiful, organic integration. Instead, according to Speyerbach, the clash of cultures was a disaster that resulted in severe safety issues, harassment, and an unlivable environment, particularly for the young female students living there.
Okay, let's take a serious breath here because I know those examples are intense.
They are very heavy.
They're exactly the kinds of visceral, heavy topics that instantly start shouting matches and just shut down dialogue on social media. But remember, our mission today, we are looking at why Speyerbach is bringing them up. She isn't just listing true crime statistics to be inflammatory.
Right.
She is using these examples to diagnose a specific psychological condition within the ruling class.
To understand her diagnosis, we really need to dive into the deep philosophical divide between universalism and particularism.
Let's break those down.
Okay, so universalism, which is the absolute bedrock of the globalist view, was heavily codified after World War II with documents like the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And the intention was incredibly noble.
Of course.
It was to prevent atrocities by establishing that abstract rights apply equally to all individuals anywhere, completely regardless of their cultural baggage or national borders. It assumes humans are essentially rational blank slates.
But Speyerbach is arguing from the stance of particularism.
Correct. Particularism, the localist view, argues that humans rarely act solely as isolated, perfectly rational individuals. Throughout all of history, they act as groups.
They have tribes.
Exactly. They have deep ethnic, cultural, and religious loyalties, and they will naturally act to advantage their own group, often at the direct expense of the original local population.
So when the technocrats build their models, they assume everyone will act like a perfectly rational, individual economic unit who just wants to, pay taxes and go to the grocery store.
Right.
But when you actually put wildly different cultures in a single housing complex in Amsterdam, they act like, people. With all their historic tribalism, patriarchal norms, and cultural friction, the theory completely fails the reality test.
And this leads us to the psychological mechanism Speyerbach focuses on. She calls it willful blindness. She asks a really profound question about accountability. How do the elites, the people who designed these integration policies, how do they react when confronted with the glaring failures?
Well, when they see the data.
When they see the grooming gangs or the failed housing projects or the overwhelmed public services, do they adjust their models?
According to her, absolutely not. They don't admit fault. In fact, they can't. She says they suffer from an extreme systemic case of the emperor's new clothes syndrome.
That's a great analogy.
Right. Because to admit that diversity isn't always an enrichment, to admit that some cultures might hold values that are fundamentally incompatible with Western liberal democracy, that would require them to abandon their moral high ground. It would require them to admit that their grand scientific vision of the world is just wrong.
And the maintenance of this illusion requires a massive sociological barrier. We have to look at how insulated this elite class truly is. It's really all about preserving social status within their educational and professional bubbles.
They live in a bubble.
They do. The politicians, the judges, the policy drafters, they don't live in the working class neighborhoods dealing with the immediate fallout of mass migration. They live in affluent suburbs. They send their kids to private or highly selective schools. The working class bears the entire brunt of the social friction.
So by ignoring the tangible suffering of the working class, the elite maintain their self-image as morally superior, enlightened, global citizens.
Precisely.
And worse, when the working-class citizens complain that their neighborhoods are becoming unsafe or unrecognizable, the elite don't just ignore them. They actively disdain them.
They look down on them.
Yeah. They dismiss the complaining citizens as simply racist, uneducated, or backward, which super conveniently absolves the elite from having to fix the problem they created in the first place.
It is an incredibly powerful structural critique of elite groupthink. The psychological insulation is a required survival trait in those high society circles. If you question the universalist dogma, you are cast out.
You lose your status.
You lose everything. And just when you think this interview is going to remain purely in the realm of high-level political theory, Speyerbach provides a real-world analogy to explain this dictation of reality. And it comes from a completely unexpected, wildly different industry.
Yes, and this pivot is fascinating. I was not expecting this at all. Because before she was writing philosophical essays on technocracy and debating the future of Europe, André Speyerbach actually spent over 25 years working as a successful designer in the fashion industry.
Right.
Specifically, she designed women's lingerie.
It seems like a bizarre detour for a political interview, I'll admit, but the structural parallels she draws between high fashion and high politics are surprisingly illuminating.
Totally. So she explains that for decades, the absolute pinnacle of the fashion elite, the taste makers in Paris and Milan, the magazine editors at Vogue, the high-end designers whom she notes were predominantly gay men in powerful gatekeeping positions, they strictly, rigidly dictated the aesthetic ideal for women's bodies. And that ideal was very specific, extremely narrow hips and very small breasts. That was the heroin chic or high fashion look.
And it wasn't just presented as a stylistic preference for the runway, it was established as the normative standard. It was pushed down through media and advertising as the objective truth of what was beautiful, elegant, and good.
But here's the catch that Speyerbach noticed. She says that if you walked out of the insulated high fashion studios and just asked the common man on the street what he actually found attractive or asked normal women what they felt comfortable in the run, was entirely different.
Vastly different.
9 times out of 10, the general public vastly preferred larger curves. The public's grounded reality was fundamentally opposed to the elite's theoretical reality.
But the power dynamic was entirely top-down and one-sided. Speyerbach recalls the intense social pressure within the industry. If anyone inside the fashion world agreed with the common man, if a designer tried to create clothing that celebrated actual curves, they were socially and professionally ostracized.
They were exiled.
They were dismissed as dumb farmers who lacked refinement and didn't understand true, elevated art.
She even shares a really vulnerable personal story to highlight how vicious this was. She said she was explicitly told by a major fashion editor that she herself could not be photographed for a magazine feature about her own brand, simply because her own breasts were too large.
That's awful.
Right. She physically did not fit the narrative they were forcing on the world, so she had to be hidden. And the tragic, widespread result of this elite monopoly was that millions of everyday women internalized this artificial standard. They bought uncomfortable minimizer bras. They starved themselves. They felt deep shame about their natural bodies. Well, sorry, all because a tiny group of disconnected people at the top decided what reality was supposed to look like.
I think we can draw a direct line here to how cultural narratives are enforced. You have a small, highly insulated elite setting a normative standard. Whether that standard is small breasts are the only beautiful shape in fashion, or unrestricted globalism and mass migration is the only moral policy in politics.
It's the same mechanism.
It is. The general public, the people actually living in the real world and dealing with the consequences, inherently disagree. But they are shamed into silence. The woman with curves is terrified of being fat or vulgar, just as the citizen concerned about local crime is terrified of being destroyed socially and professionally by being labeled a racist or a bigot.
It is the exact same mechanism of control through social shaming. The elite don't need to pass a law making curves illegal. They just have to make it socially unacceptable to acknowledge them.
I was thinking about how to frame this disconnect, and it reminds me heavily of the phenomenon we see with movie critics versus audience scores on aggregation sites like Rotten Tomatoes.
Oh, that's a perfect parallel. You see it all the time.
Exactly. You have a film, perhaps a stark 4-hour black and white meditation on existential grief.
Sounds like a blast.
Right. And the professional critics, the elites of the film world, they give it a 98% rating because they prize abstract theory, subversion of expectations, and refinement. But the audience score sits at 12% because for the average person who just worked a 40-hour week, the movie is agonizingly boring and depressing.
Yeah, they just want to be entertained.
Conversely, A fun, straightforward action movie that respects traditional storytelling gets a 95% from the audience, but the critics give it a 20% and sneer at it as trash for the
Oh,
masses.
true.
The critics don't have to pay for the movie ticket with hard-earned wages in the same way the working class does, just as the political technocrats don't bear the social costs of their immigration policies. The elites value theory. The locals value a reality that works.
But Speyerbach doesn't just leave us with the depressing reality of the problem, right? Her fashion analogy also provides the historical precedent for the solution. Because how was that ironclad fashion monopoly finally broken? Today, the landscape is very different.
The monopoly was shattered by technology, specifically social media.
Right. She says platforms like Instagram allowed women to bypass the magazine editors and the gatekeepers completely. Normal women just started posting photos of their actual curvy bodies.
They democratized the image.
Exactly. They found each other online, they realized they weren't the crazy ones, they weren't alone in their preferences, and the sheer volume of decentralized reality simply overwhelmed and shattered the elite narrative. The high-end magazines had to adapt to reality, or they would have gone bankrupt.
It demonstrates the immense power of decentralization. It removed the bottleneck of the elite editors, which implies, conceptually, that a decentralized political awakening could shatter the technocratic narrative in the exact same way.
But that raises a massive, glaring question. If social media broke the fashion monopoly over a decade ago, why hasn't it successfully broken the political monopoly yet? I mean, people tweet angrily about politics all day long. We have endless alternative media. Yet the gray men are still quietly laying the tracks to Brussels. Why did the picture-sharing app work for bodies, but the text-sharing apps fail for borders?
That is the crucial distinction, and it leads directly into Speyerbach's realization of her own past failures and her blueprint for what must actually be done. In fashion, the product is just an image. Changing the image changes the industry.
Right.
In politics, the product is infrastructure. Angry tweets aren't enough to dismantle a bureaucracy. Furthermore, electing a single, charismatic populist figurehead to shout those angry tweets from a podium isn't enough. You cannot beat a massive, entrenched infrastructure with a single messiah. You have to build your own infrastructure.
And this is where the rubber really meets the road in her philosophy.
Yep.
Speyerbach stresses, with incredible urgency, that the European electorate needs to completely stop waiting for a savior.
It's a futile hope.
She explicitly names contemporary figures like Geert Wilders or Peter Omtzigt in the Netherlands, men who have won massive electoral victories on populist promises. She even cautions her European audience against looking at Donald Trump or Elon Musk in the U.S. as a viable model for European reform.
She draws a very important, highly technical distinction between the American and European bureaucratic systems here, which explains why populism functions differently on the two continents.
Break that down for us.
Okay, so in the United States government, there is a recognized mechanism known as the spoils system, specifically political appointments like Schedule C appointees. When a new president takes office, they legally have the power to swap out thousands of civil servants, agency heads, and judges.
Oh, wow. So they can just clean house.
They can effectively decapitate the old executive bureaucracy and install their own loyalists to enact rapid sweeping change.
You win the election, you get to sweep the house clean and bring in your own team.
Yes, but in Europe, and specifically in nations like the Netherlands, that mechanism simply does not exist. European governance is largely based on the Weberian ideal of an independent, permanent civil service.
Permanent. That's the key word.
Exactly. These bureaucrats serve the state as an ongoing entity, not the elected government of the day. So the permanent civil service, what some might colloquially call the European deep state, it remains firmly, legally in place regardless of who wins the parliamentary elections. The cabinet ministers might change every 4 years, but the thousands of gray men who actually write the memos, interpret the treaties, and execute the laws do not budge.
So paint a picture of what happens when a populist wins in Europe. Let's say the ultimate anti-globalist candidate wins an unprecedented majority. They walk into the government ministry on day one, and the entire staff, the people they rely on to actually draft their laws, is actively hostile to their agenda. And because those civil servants have been there for 20 years, they know exactly how to use bureaucratic red tape, legal reviews, and endless committee studies to stall the new leader until the next election cycle rolls around.
Exactly. The politician is completely neutralized by the machine they're supposed to be commanding. Therefore, Speyerbach concludes, waiting for a political messiah to storm the castle will always, inevitably, result in failure. It just leads to deeper public depression and further erosion of trust in democracy.
So what's her alternative?
The solution she proposes is a total paradigm shift. Her mantra is, do not try to politicize the bureaucracy. You must bureaucratize the politics.
Bureaucratize the politics. That sounds like fighting fire with fire. What does that actually look like in practice?
It means building a massive, well-funded, highly professionalized counter-infrastructure. She calls for the creation of an anti-globalist, anti-technocratic think tank, or gremium. But unlike traditional political parties that waste all their resources fighting each other for votes in the 10% sandbox, this entity would operate entirely behind the scenes.
Like a shadow bureaucracy.
Yes, exactly like a shadow bureaucracy. It would employ its own armies of top-tier lawyers, policy experts, constitutional scholars, and researchers. And their job wouldn't be to run for office or give speeches. Their job would be to do the grueling, unglamorous work of drafting incredibly specific, legally bulletproof policy proposals. They would comb through European treaties to find the necessary legal loopholes and then hand those prepackaged, ready-to-sign policies on a silver platter to any political party willing to use them.
Wait, any party. So this shadow bureaucracy wouldn't be ideologically pure, they just work with anyone.
They are strategically pure, not ideologically pure. Their goal is the outcome, not the credit. Speyerbach points out the brilliant versatility of this approach. The think tank could go to a hard-left, traditionally socialist party like the SP in the Netherlands and say, we know your primary concern is protecting the wages of the local working class from corporate exploitation. Here is a legally sound 200-page policy proposal to heavily restrict the importation of cheap foreign labor.
Okay, and
Then that exact same think tank walks across the aisle to a hard-right populist party like the PVV or FVD and says, we know your primary concern is cultural preservation and stopping demographic shifts. Here is a slightly different legal mechanism that achieves the exact same border restriction, framed in a way your voters will support.
wow. That is an incredibly cynical, almost Machiavellian strategy. It's kind of like an arms dealer in a war zone.
It really is.
The arms dealer doesn't care which general gets his face on the statue. The arms dealer doesn't care if the soldiers are wearing red uniforms or blue uniforms or what their ideology is. The arms dealer's only goal is to make sure both armies are buying and using weapons that accidentally push the front line in the exact same geographic direction.
It is deeply pragmatic and, yes, somewhat cynical. But mechanistically, it is highly accurate to how power is wielded by the current establishment. The brilliance of this strategy is that it completely bypasses the competitive, ego-driven nature of politicians.
Because they can't help themselves.
Right. You aren't asking the left-wing leader and the right-wing leader to hold hands on a stage and agree, which they will never do because it alienates their respective voter bases. You are feeding them tailored policies that allow them to continue attacking each other on television, maintaining the illusion of the crumb fight, while behind the scenes, both policies drag the country toward the exact same structural reform.
Okay, so if this shadow bureaucracy is pulling the strings to change the trajectory, what is their ultimate destination? What is the overarching goal? What is the actual counter-narrative to globalism?
Speyerbach boils the ultimate objective down to two core concepts: restoring national sovereignty and enforcing the principle of subsidiarity.
Subsidiarity. That is a word that sounds like a disease your accountant gets. What does it actually mean in the context of saving democracy?
It is the direct philosophical antidote to universal globalism. Subsidiarity actually has roots in Catholic social teaching, but as a political organizing principle, it dictates that matters ought to be handled by the smallest, lowest, or least centralized competent authority.
Give me an example of how that works.
It means that a decision about how to zone a housing project in Amsterdam should absolutely not be made by a compliance officer in Brussels who has never visited the city. A decision about nitrogen emissions for dairy farming in the rural province of Friesland should not be dictated by a climate NGO headquartered in Geneva.
Right, keep it local.
It is the core localized philosophy that people living in a specific community possess a unique, embedded wisdom about their local environment that a distant spreadsheet model can never replicate. Subsidiarity pushes power down to the ground level.
I understand the appeal of the theory. It sounds incredibly empowering. But practically speaking, is this even remotely possible? We are talking about building a multi-million-dollar, highly professionalized infrastructure from scratch.
It's a massive undertaking.
Right, because the globalists have NATO, the EU bureaucracy, the World Economic Forum, and endless billions in government subsidies fueling their think tanks. The anti-establishment side is traditionally fractured, notoriously broke, and relies on, part-time volunteers and YouTube channels. Can you actually build a machine to fight the machine?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question, and Speyerbach is very sober about the reality of it. She acknowledges that this is a 20-year project. It's a generational undertaking that requires immense patience and resources.
But people are angry now.
Exactly. She recognizes human psychology. People are feeling that mild depression right now. You cannot just tell a frustrated, angry electorate to sit back and wait 2 decades while you quietly hire lawyers. They need to see friction now, which is why she isn't just theorizing about the future. She is taking immediate, highly disruptive legal action.
Which brings us to the final major piece of her puzzle, the lawsuit.
Yes, the lawsuit.
Because Speyerbach isn't just an author. She has founded an actual organization called Democratic RenewalExecutive, which translates to Democratic Renewal. And they are currently preparing to sue the Dutch state. They're literally taking their own government to court.
And the legal and philosophical question at the very heart of this lawsuit is profound. She is asking the court to legally rule on whether the state has neglected its fundamental duty of care to protect its own local indigenous population against the demonstrable, measurable damages of mass migration.
And she doesn't just speak in abstracts. She specifically lists the damages she wants the court to acknowledge. Things like the immense crippling pressure on the national housing market, a statistical loss of physical safety in once quiet neighborhoods, and the intangible but deeply felt destruction of social cohesion. Now, she mentions in the interview that she is actively looking for a high-profile, courageous lawyer willing to take this unprecedented case into the courtroom. But what is really intriguing to me and what reveals her deeper strategy is her motivation. She explicitly says that winning the lawsuit isn't even the primary goal.
Which is a fascinating legal strategy. Why invest massive amounts of time and capital to sue the state if you don't even expect a judge to rule in your favor?
Yep, because she wants to force a definitive answer. She wants to use the legal system to break the endless, maddening cycle of political finger-pointing.
Ah, the closed loop.
Yeah. Right now, a populist politician goes on TV and says, I would love to stop immigration and fix the housing crisis, but the judges won't let me because of international treaties. And then the judges release a statement saying, we don't make the laws, we are simply interpreting the treaties the politicians willingly signed.
Everyone blames everyone else.
Exactly. It is a closed loop of zero accountability. The car is crashing, and everyone in the front seat is pointing at someone else. Speyerbach says this lawsuit is designed to force the system to admit the truth on the public record.
Are politicians truly powerless because of overly broad, binding legal interpretations? Or do politicians actually have the legal power to stop this, but just lack the political courage to use it?
That's the question.
It is a brilliantly designed legal trap, inspired in part by the very tactics used by environmental NGOs. In the Netherlands, there was a famous case called the Urgenda climate case. Activists successfully sued the state to force it to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, citing human rights.
So she's using their playbook.
Yes. Speyerbach is attempting to flip that exact legal mechanism to force a localist agenda. By demanding a ruling on whether local rights or cultural continuity exist in the face of universal human rights, she is forcing the judicial branch to codify what has previously been left entirely unwritten.
What do you mean by unwritten? Why wouldn't local rights already be in the Constitution?
Because for centuries, they didn't need to be. She provides a really vital historical context here. Before the European Union, before this modern era of hyperglobalization and supranational courts, there was no need to write down laws specifically protecting local Dutch culture or local community cohesion. It was protected by default.
Why?
Because the leaders, the mayors, the judges, the prime ministers, the police chiefs, they came from those exact communities. They were deeply embedded in the culture. They naturally protected it because it was their culture.
It was an implicit understanding.
Precisely. But now that absolute decision-making power has been outsourced to supranational bodies and universal human rights frameworks like the European Convention on Human Rights are used to dictate local policy, that natural implicit protection is gone.
Right.
And because it was never explicitly codified into law, because the founders of these nations never thought they would need to legally protect their own existence from their own government, there is currently no legal shield protecting the particular against the universal.
Okay, I want you, the listener, to put yourself in the robes of the judge who eventually hears this case. How on earth do you quantify damage to local culture with hard, admissible data?
It's incredibly difficult.
How do you prove in a court of law that a neighborhood has lost its social cohesion? You can't put a feeling of alienation on a spreadsheet. When the international treaties explicitly guarantee the rights of an asylum seeker, how do you legally weigh that against the abstract right of a local citizen to recognize their own neighborhood? It feels almost impossibly subjective.
From a strictly legal standpoint, it is an incredibly steep uphill battle. Proving a direct causal link between state policy and the loss of social cohesion to the satisfaction of a high court is daunting. But Speyerbach's argument is that the attempt itself is the victory.
Even if they lose.
Even if the judge strikes the case down. Even if the court formally rules that, legally speaking, local citizens have absolutely no rights to cultural continuity that supersedes international universal rights, even that negative ruling is a massive victory for clarity.
Because it destroys the illusion.
Exactly. Because once that ruling is on paper, signed by a judge, the politicians can no longer hide behind ambiguity. The public will finally see, in black and white, exactly where the power lies. The crumb fight will be fully exposed for the hollow theater that it is. The voters will realize that national elections do not matter if the legal framework of the nation fundamentally subordinates them to globalist treaties.
It's about turning the blinding fluorescent lights on in the room, even if you are terrified of what you're going to see scurrying across the floor.
That's a great way to picture it.
And that really brings us to the ultimate conclusion of Speyerbach's thesis. She is brutally, refreshingly honest. There is no quick fix, there is no magic wand, and there is no charismatic savior coming to rescue the West. It is going to take decades of grueling, unglamorous work to build a new world. But forcing this clarity through provocative lawsuits, through the painstaking construction of shadow bureaucracies, through absolutely refusing to play the politician sandbox games anymore, that is the first unavoidable step.
So as we synthesize this massive, complex journey we've been on today,
And it has been a long one.
it has. We started with the raw, personal frustration of modern politics, that profound feeling of depression when voting seems to change absolutely nothing. We looked under the hood and discovered the silent architectural power of the technocracy and the unaccountable gray men.
Right.
We explored the deep, seemingly irreconcilable philosophical clash between elite universalism and grounded local reality, taking that fascinating detour through the lingerie industry to deeply understand the mechanics of elite groupthink and willful blindness.
Which was wild.
And finally, we arrived at Speyerbach's highly concrete, albeit daunting, blueprint for fighting back. The necessity of building a counter-bureaucracy to feed policies to the politicians and launching a landmark lawsuit to force total legal clarity on the system.
It is a staggering amount of information to chew on, and as we wrap up this deep dive, I wanted to leave you, the listener, with a challenge.
Yeah.
I want you to look at your own spheres of influence, look at your workplace, your local community, and perhaps most importantly, your own media consumption and political beliefs.
It's good to self-reflect.
Where are you blindly putting your cart on the shiny rails laid out by distant experts simply because it's easier and socially safer than fighting the current? And where might you need to stop trusting the glossy helicopter view reports and start trusting the grounded, messy common sense of the people actually walking on the street?
And I will leave you with one final, perhaps deeply uncomfortable, provocative thought to mull over as you digest all of this.
Go for it.
Speyerbach's proposed solution to an oppressive, unelected, out-of-touch technocracy is, essentially, to build a counter-technocracy. She wants to build a shadow bureaucracy of highly educated lawyers, policy wonks, and elite think tanks operating behind closed doors, feeding policies to politicians to manipulate the system from the inside out.
It is fighting fire with a much more organized fire.
Indeed. But if the anti-globalists succeed in building this massive, efficient, ruthless political machine, do they not risk inevitably becoming the exact same gray men they set out to destroy? If the only possible way to defeat a sprawling bureaucracy is to build a colder, more calculating bureaucracy of your own to pull the strings, we have to ask a terrifying question. Is true, messy, organic, bottom-up democracy already dead?
That is a chilling thought to end on. If you want to fix the disconnected steering wheel, do you just have to accept that you must become the mechanic who builds an even bigger wall between the driver and the engine? Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly complex deep dive. We ask you to look behind the curtain today, to look at the gears of the machine, and whether you agree with Speyerbach's philosophy or profoundly disagree with it, we hope this conversation keeps you questioning the narrative you are given. Keep your eyes on the road and keep asking who is really doing the driving.